And with that, Ultima IX and the Ultima series has ended. The Avatar successfully used the 8 sigils to perform the Barrier of Life ritual, trapped the Guardian with him inside the barrier, and then performed the Armageddon ritual to destroy both himself and the Guardian and cause their essences to merge back into the entity that was known long ago as the Stranger and ascend to a higher plane of existence. The evil columns were cleansed with the runes of virtue before disintegrating and flying up into the heavens, thus ending the threat of the moons crashing down upon Britannia. I hope the Avatar's companions weren't still in the columns when that part happened. And I wonder what happened to the runes. And the Codex, for that matter, since the Avatar had it with him. Maybe it's finally been returned to the ethereal void? We know that the 8 sigils were destroyed by the Armageddon ritual, yet somehow the Ankh of Spirituality was there to be found by Raven amidst the ruins of Turfan, and it seemed to match with the constellation of an Ankh in the sky. Is it a sign from the Stranger, or merely an affirmation that the virtues, spirituality in particular, can survive even the end of the world? That's left for us to interpret for ourselves, since the Avatar's story ended there. EA did announce a 10th entry for the series in August of 2003, titled Ultima X: Odyssey, which was going to be an MMORPG built using the Unreal Engine. The premise was that the Avatar and the Guardian didn't fuse together all that well, and were locked in a struggle to take control of their new self. This manifested as a plane of existence called Alucinor, which in Latin kind of means to wander in the mind or dream. And players would end up here and do virtuous stuff to help strengthen the Avatar so he could suppress the Guardian. Don't want that fella making a comeback after all. But since Richard Garriott was gone at this point, and the game was cancelled in June of 2004 anyway because EA chose once again to focus on Ultima Online, it's most definitely not canon. Just some interesting trivia. As far as we players are concerned, the story really did end with Ultima IX. This Let's Play took a lot longer than I thought it was going to, because I misremembered the game as being sparse and devoid of content. I figured taking on this little project would be good for a laugh. But by about the 30th video, I realized it was going to go into the triple digits, and indeed it did. There are 130 gameplay videos, each an average length of 33 minutes, coming to a total of 72 hours of content. That's 3 days. So yeah, little miscalculation there. And at times I felt as though I had bitten off more than I could chew. But hey, I am nothing if not a completionist, so I made sure to finish what I started. I guess it depends on whom you ask, but maybe it's a good thing that the accusations about my liking the sound of my own voice have an element of truth to them. I've gotten to know this game quite well after spending so much time researching and playing it, so before I continue, I'd like to say that it wasn't all bad. I had a lot of fun meddling with the Guardian's plans for conquest and found myself laughing, truly honestly laughing, on more than one occasion, and not just out of frustration or despondency. Though there was plenty of that too, of course. There's no denying that this was a tragically flawed game that could have been so much better. In my opening remarks when I started this all those months ago, I listed some well-known problems with Ultima IX to help set the stage for the journey ahead. Now that we've made it through and seen everything firsthand, let's talk about them in more detail. First, frustrating bugs. Patch 1.19F made the game a lot more playable than I remember it being, but there were still a fair number of moments that left me utterly confounded. Some were so bad I'd have to stop my recording session and figure out what was going on so I didn't end up with 10 minutes of footage of my experimenting with everything on the screen to try to get past some random weird situation. I know that may sound like it would have been fun to watch, but it wouldn't have been, and you're going to have to trust me on this one. All that said, I don't recall encountering any bugs that prevented me from advancing the plot, and I believe that's arguably more important. Second, crashes to desktop. Unfortunately, these still lurked around here and there. I had planned to include more instances of them as they happened, but the problem is that they corrupted my recordings, and I would lose most of the footage leading up to the crash. It was extremely frustrating when this happened, and some nights I would lose hours of work to this garbage. I think the only time I managed to salvage some footage from before a crash and not simply start the whole session over again entirely was near the beginning of the game when the Avatar took on Tristan and his band of brigands, that crew who had kidnapped that woman who resided with her son in the house between Britain and Pause. After spending a lot of time stitching that video together, I decided the process wasn't worth the effort and began starting over if I encountered a crash during recording. So for better or worse, I'm afraid that for practical reasons, I had to artificially limit that part of the experience. Third, missing content. We can't really point at stuff that isn't there, so as players, it's hard to know just how much was cut in the interest of meeting deadlines. But we did have some clues going into it. The Avatar had to go it alone again because there was no party mechanic, and NPCs stood around in the same place all day and night because there was no scheduling mechanic. But hey, at least the Avatar could bake bread again. We also know that there was a substantial amount of content cut from the storyline as the game underwent its various transformations, and that's perhaps the most disappointing missing content, especially if you take the time to read what Bob White had planned originally. Things could have been quite different. Fourth, squarely combat. I didn't find the combat to be all that bad, but it certainly wasn't anything special. The developers clearly wanted it to be more fun and varied than that, considering all the special moves the Avatar could learn. But at the end of the day, things generally worked out best when they were kept simple. Just hit stuff till it dies. That said, I'll never forget that sinking feeling when the Avatar would show off and do that stupid flourish with the one-handed sword instead of striking the enemy right in front of him. Still probably better than being a caster, though. I don't think relying on magic 100% would have been much fun. It was great for crowd control and healing, but the damage spells felt weak and expensive. Fifth, hokey dialogue. Unfortunately, this one was a serious problem, and I'm going to tear it apart. There were 3 primary issues with the dialogue, the first of which being the writing. While the individual dialogue lines were often disappointing in their own way and led to a world of NPCs that weren't particularly interesting, even worse was the writing with regard to character development. I'm referring primarily to characters who had appeared in the previous games. They just didn't seem like themselves, and I think that's because the writers didn't do their homework. And then there was Raven and the problematic romance. I did that in air quotes. I complained about that and how it was a terrible disservice to the character quite enough during the Let's Play, so I'm not going to do it again here. But I will say that the Avatar's short-lived dalliance with Nastasia in Ultima IX Part 1 was more rewarding and believable, despite being barely a footnote in that game. The second issue with the dialogue was the dialogue system itself, specifically the choosing of dialogue options. I understand that the designers were aiming to make things flow more naturally and appear to be more conversational, but I found myself constantly frustrated when dialogue options would be removed from a certain spot and could only be reached by starting the dialogue over again. Unless, of course, you happened to set a flag with one of the things you said, which meant that opportunity was now gone. For most players, perhaps this is fine, and even better, because it's more like how people actually speak with one another. But by now, you know my style and can see why this drove me nuts. Details are important, and I wanted to hear all of them. This game made that very difficult to achieve. The third and final issue with the dialogue was the voice acting. I don't want to crap on the work of these artists all that much, since I'm no voice actor myself. Though I think I'd like to be one. So if you know someone in the industry, tell them about your old pal DJ. But it was quite uneven. Some was fine, but much of it was questionable and totally broke immersion for me. The accents were all over the place too. I had no idea Britannia had such a diverse population. Props to Audrey Peterson for her portrayal of Raven, and to Bill Johnson for making the Guardian as terrible and malevolent as he's always been. Fun fact, Michael Dorn, who played Worf in Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, was originally going to be the voice of the Guardian in Ultima IX. He even recorded all the lines before the team decided they needed Bill back. I'm sure Michael would have been a great Guardian, but he wouldn't have been our Guardian. Sixth, poor level design. I don't think the dungeons were all that badly designed. They were sufficiently dangerous and, at times, weird. The problems mostly came in the form of places the Avatar could get physically stuck and in glitches that caused the camera to reveal more than it was supposed to. There were also way too many walls with unintentional creases in them, objects floating in midair, and items hanging midway out of locked chests, and, as you might imagine, those things tend to break immersion. A final nitpick that I'd say falls under level design is, what was up with all those keys? We had 9 unused keys in our inventory at the end of the game, and there would have been more if we hadn't gone and used some of them on several nonsense locks. 7th, and finally, an utter lack of regard for the canon and lore of the beloved and long-running Ultima series. Yeah, about that. No excuses, Origin. This was the biggest betrayal of them all. Ultima IX feels self-contained. It doesn't stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before it, much to its detriment considering how incredible those giants were. A series that makes it this far, quantitatively speaking, achieves such success not only because of the strength of the individual entries, but also the momentum each one adds to the collection as a whole. Ultima VIII alienated a lot of players for obvious reasons, but Ultima IX showed that the old Ultima magic was gone for good. While it does seem to genuinely try to be another story about the 8 virtues, it does so by using Britannia, a land of fantastic history and transformation over time, as nothing but a backdrop, which is a real shame. Britannia is more than that to seasoned Ultima players, and we want to know about the world and how the Guardians' meddling has changed it because we're invested in its survival and growth. We learn that chunks of land are gone, cities have disappeared, and important places have inexplicably moved across the map. Is any of this addressed? No. We're just supposed to accept it and go about saving the place again. But it's not the Britannia we remember and bonded with, so that doesn't really connect. The Avatar's old companions and others like Lord British and Gwenno missed the mark as well. They've been through some stuff together, and I for one would have appreciated it if the writers had paid more attention to that. Again, Ultima veterans invested a lot of time in these games, and with that comes a certain expectation of payoff. I feel that the few callbacks wedged in at the end of the game, like Yolo mentioning how he saved the Avatar from the gargoyles in the intro cinematic of Ultima VI, or Shamino mentioning how the Avatar saved him from the Shadow Lords in the intro cinematic of Ultima V, were quite feeble. How about discussing the trauma of what happened on Serpent Isle at the end of Ultima VII Part 2 at the very least? It was kind of a big deal, and it's the last time y'all even saw the Avatar. No? Alright, whatever. And then there are straight-up plot holes, like, how did the Guardian get a new Black Gate built in Britannia? Because the last time he tried that, the effort involved was enormous, and it necessitated the founding of an entire pseudo-religious organization to divert attention from the machinations of Batlin as he directed construction of the gate. And for the record, Batlin was far more cunning and competent than Blackthorn, so if he couldn't do it... Anyway, the Black Gate would apparently only work during the Astronomical Alignment, an event that was imminent at the time of Ultima VII Part 1, but that only happens once every 800 years. So what about that? Pretty sure the Avatar hasn't been away from Britannia for nearly a millennium, so is that just not a rule anymore? And speaking of Blackthorn, where did he even come from? How did he get back to Britannia, and why was he a jerk again? And he was after the Codex of Ultimate Wisdom, but how and why was it retrieved from the ethereal void in the first place? And how did it end up in the hands of Sam Hain? Why was the purple Codex lens blue? Why didn't Dupre's resurrection destroy the Chaos Serpent and plunge the world into imbalance? How is Pyros able to be summoned to Britannia after the Avatar hoovered up all his power into the Tongue of Flame as fuel for the black obelisk he used to get back home? How did Korgan's Fang find its way to the Museum of Britannia before the Avatar did, seeing as how the only way it could have gotten to Britannia in the first place was by being on his person when he arrived in Britannia at the beginning of the game? If the Avatar was the Titan of Ether, shouldn't he have had some cool powers or his own brand of magic that worked without having to cleanse the shrines of the virtues? And no, linear spells don't count. And why, oh why, was the Avatar on Earth at the beginning of the game? This could go on for quite a while longer, but I think we've endured enough suffering. The bottom line is that Ultima IX didn't do the storyline of the series justice, and seeing as how justice is one of the 8 virtues, that's unforgivable. Boo! And we discovered new negatives as we played. The user interface was quite cumbersome and wonky. The journal entries were at times eyebrow-raising. The audio engineering was in dire need of attention. There were too many situations where the background noise was so loud and obnoxious that I was forced to adjust it in post-production. The physics engine was downright wacky, as evidenced by how we were able to make such peculiar abstract art sculptures out of the stuff we left in the Avatar's room in Castle British, or when we propped up our weapons in strange places so we could climb atop them. The mana equals karma thing wasn't great, especially considering that at the end of the game, we still only had a maximum mana pool of 179 instead of 200, despite having cleansed all 8 shrines and doing every virtuous thing we could do. Perhaps worst of all, that fountain in Lord British's castle broke and never worked again. There are more negatives, but let's move on to the positives. This list isn't as long, unfortunately, but I've identified some things that I think are the game's strengths, even if many of them must be buoyed by statements like, considering the circumstances, or, at the time the game was made. The most obvious positive, in my opinion, is the game's aesthetic. At the time the game was made, these graphics were quite impressive and managed to bring many a gaming rig to its knees. While that may not necessarily be something to brag about if your goal is to make something players can play, it does demonstrate how much effort went into bringing the beauty and detail of Britannia to life in this engine. The world is pretty. There are critters everywhere. Day and night come and go. And there's the occasional rainstorm to help set the mood. There are also quite a few biomes, settings, and city-specific architectural styles to keep things new and interesting throughout the Avatar's travels. It speaks volumes that Ultima IX, developed in the early days of 3D gaming, still looks as good as it does 20 years after its release. It's aged fairly well. For context, but certainly not comparison, The Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion, which was rightly hailed in many circles as the most gorgeous game of its time, hit shelves 6.5 years later. Another positive is that the game is, well, playable. I know it's ridiculous to congratulate commercial software for running as intended, but considering the circumstances, it's somewhat appropriate here. I never mentioned this, but shortly after the game's release, Origin mailed their Ultima IX customers a CD containing a patch that made the game a bit more playable. It really was that bad at launch, and the blame for that one lies entirely with EA and its draconian deadlines. But the official patches still didn't do enough, which is how we ended up with the unofficial patch 1.19F being distributed online. It didn't fix everything, and I did already complain about the crashes that ate up so much of my time during recording. But really, without that patch, I don't think I would have been able to do this at all, so thank you once again, anonymous developer, for doing the right thing. You're a legend. And because the game was playable, that leads me to the next positive. There was plenty of game to play, even with all the content cuts it endured. This is quite a long game, especially if you take it semi-seriously and endeavor to see everything there is to see, which is what we did. At the time the game was made, open-world RPGs weren't common. They started popping up in droves a few years later, but I'd like to give credit where credit is due on this one. The team did a good job building a giant, sprawling realm for the Avatar to explore, even if the scale felt a bit off. Britannia does seem like a smaller place in Ultima IX than it did in Ultima VII Part 1, but let's be fair. As noted earlier, this Let's Play did end up being extremely long, and though much of that can be attributed to my style of play and narration, there was a lot of stuff that needed doing before the Avatar could deal with the Guardian properly. Finally, and this one doesn't have any caveats, the music was excellent. I pay attention to music in games because I used to be a composer myself, and much of what I wrote sounded like it was meant to be in games. Maybe I still am a composer. I don't know if you just stop being one if you don't compose for a few years, but anyway, Ultima IX's soundtrack was composed by George Olje, and what he did was quite clever. We could tell that each virtue-aligned city had a track that played prior to the associated shrine's cleansing and another that played after, and I incorrectly thought it was as simple as the former being in a minor key and the latter being in a major key. But there were also familiar elements that seemed to pop up across the cities. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but after doing some additional research, I discovered that he wrote a unique theme for each of the three principles: truth, love, and courage, and each of the three anti-principles: falsehood, hatred, and cowardice, and then combined these themes based on a given city's aligned virtue and the state of the associated shrine. So, for example, U is the city of justice, and the virtue of justice is the principle of truth tempered by the principle of love. As a result, U's pre-cleansing track contained the themes of falseness and hatred, while its post-cleansing track contained the themes of truth and love. That explains why the same melodies kept popping up here and there, and I think it's fantastic. Which reminds me, there is a track for post-cleansing Valoria, but it never played for us, which is unfortunate. There were also a few other fun tracks that never changed, like Buccaneer's Den, for example. I do think it's a shame that there wasn't more music for exploring the wilderness and that sort of thing, since good atmospheric music can make that part of a game seem downright epic. A missed opportunity to be sure, but I'm still quite happy with what we got. I'd also like to take a moment to revisit my thoughts on the game's troubled development. I've worked in software development for over 15 years now and know how things can go, and I've heard horror stories about game development in particular. I read the history of Ultima IX's many production challenges and gave my analysis based on that, but when it comes down to it, I wasn't there. I don't know what the team went through on a day-to-day basis, or what it felt like to be part of this moving target of a project. So, if anyone who participated in the development of Ultima IX ever sees this and is listening, I hope that the things I've said here aren't overly inaccurate or cruel. Your work is appreciated, and you did produce something impressive here. It just wasn't what most Ultima diehards expected or wanted. And to Richard Garriott, Lord British himself, creator of Ultima, thank you for this series. Your games gave and continue to give millions of players incredible worlds to explore, monsters to battle, and virtues to uphold. Ultima IX absolutely deserves all the criticism it's received, and it's disappointing as a final entry in the series. But if you can accept and look past its quirks and shortcomings, it isn't a bad game. It takes players on an epic quest across Britannia and lets us see the land with fresh eyes. I thoroughly enjoyed creating this Let's Play, and it brings me great pleasure to know that Ultima fans old and new will always be able to experience that with me as long as these videos are available. This project has been a major part of my life for the past year, and while it's strange to know that it's complete, I'm ready to move on to whatever's next. I hope that I was sufficiently thorough, and that you're finishing this Let's Play with a feeling of satisfaction. Thanks for joining me on the Avatar's final adventure.